of a couple of housekeeping items here before we get to the start of the show. Authors at Drucker is an interview series where we feature top authors that write about issues impacting business owning families. Authors at Drucker is made possible from the generous sponsorship from my good friend Jay Hughes and his foundation. The foundation is dedicated to advancing the study of family governance and generational well-being. We at the Drucker School feel very aligned and very grateful to Jay and his foundation. Last month, we featured Rob Lockenauer, co-founder and managing partner at Banyan Global. His book is called The Family Business Handbook, and it's published by Harvard Business Review. If you missed that conversation, you can catch a recording on our YouTube page or on our website. Before we begin, I wanted to just mention two other exciting initiatives that are going on at the Drucker School Global Family Business Institute. The first is our certificate program in advising family enterprises. This is a 6-module training program that institutions are partnering with us on to train their advisors to work more effectively with business owning families. And the second thing that I'm excited about is our Generational Wealth Masterclass that I shot with Jay Hughes. And Jay and I will be taking this masterclass content to our friends in Uganda. And Elaine is joining us on the call today. So Elaine, we're looking forward to sharing that content with you. And anyone else on the call that's interested in learning more about the Generational Wealth Masterclass content, please do send me an email. We will now get to the star of the show. Today's guest on Authors at Drucker is Katherine Howe. She is a New York Times bestselling and award-winning historian and novelist. She's the author of several novels for adult and young adult audiences, has edited 2 volumes of primary sources for Penguin Classics, and is the co-author with Anderson Cooper of the #1 New York Times bestselling book, Vanderbilt and Astor. Today, we have Katherine on to talk to us about Astor. So, Katherine, thank you so much for being willing to join us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, Dave. I'm really happy to be here.
So, Katherine, you are a prolific writer, and you've written about everything from pirates to witch hunts, and now you've written about 2 iconic brands and families in the Vanderbilts and the Astors. Can you take us behind the scenes a little bit as to how you got this role as a co-editor with Anderson Cooper in these books?
Absolutely. First, I have to say that I find it personally pretty amazing to be invited to address a group of people associated with a business school, because as an undergraduate, I majored in philosophy first and then in art history. So I have, my own personal training could not be less applicable when it comes to business acumen, tragically. Maybe I can pick some up from spending time in your company. I hope that that's the case. This came about because some years ago, so I started writing fiction while I was in the doctoral program in American and New England studies, which is kind of like interdisciplinary history. So building on my art history background, I worked in museums before graduate school. And because I came to fiction writing from a history perspective, I tended to do pretty intensive primary source research for any of the novels that I worked on, which is why I ended up doing edited volumes of primary sources for Penguin Classics. And any of my novels includes a historiographic essay at the end that talks a little bit about the source base and what I was thinking. And the novels all engage in historiographic questions. So a few years ago, word went out that Anderson was thinking of writing a history book, and that he was going to write about the Vanderbilts, and that he might want it to be the beginning of some kind of series. And Anderson has written books on his own before. He has written a memoir of his time as a foreign correspondent, and he has written a book with his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt, that was a collection of their correspondence back and forth over the years about their relationship and about their family. But as you can imagine, writing a history book is its own special kind of animal. And so it was determined that Anderson could use a co-author, and that person needed to be someone who had a history background and who was also comfortable and had some experience writing for a popular audience. So I was approached through my agent to see if I would be possibly a good fit for this project. And so I put together some thoughts about what the book could look like, because as you can imagine, when writing about the Vanderbilts, there's a way that you could approach the Vanderbilt family from a strictly business history perspective. There's a really amazing book by T.J. Stiles called The First Tycoon, which is largely about Commodore Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and the way that he originally built his fortune, which was first in shipping and then through consolidation of the railroads along the East Coast. So that is one approach that you could take. But because I'm coming from a more cultural history background, I was going to frame it, the way I thought it would be interesting to frame it would be around particular moments in time, keyed to particular cultural moments, especially, and also looking a lot at Vanderbilt women. So I sometimes joke and say, I know a few years later, I found out what it was that got me the job. And I could tell you what it was that got me the job. So I put together some thoughts as to what I thought the Vanderbilt book could look like. I met first with the team at Harper, who's our publisher there, presented what I thought the book could look like, and they thought it could be interesting. And so I advanced to the next round where I got to meet Anderson and his team. So I showed up at his house, put on my grown-up costume, sat down, and I'm talking a little bit about how I think the book could look. And then at one point I say, well, obviously we can't have a book about the Vanderbilt family if we don't talk about Alva's ball. And they said, what's Alva's ball? Well, Alva's ball, Alva Erskine Smith was the first, she was a avowed Confederate. She grew up, she was from a Southern slaveholding family. They had moved to New York City. And then Alva's father lost his fortune in the Civil War, and so they decamped to Paris. So she grew up kind of wrapped in the Belle Epoque in Paris. She had obtained all of the perfect taste. And then when she came back to New York City, she had all the taste and she had all the connections, but she had none of the money. And so she ended up marrying Willie K. Vanderbilt. And he was the grandson of the Commodore, if I'm not mistaken. And so her insight at that time was the Vanderbilts. And I hadn't realized this until I actually started working on this book, because I thought Vanderbilt is an old Dutch name. Surely they're an old Dutch family. And they were to a certain extent. But in the Gilded Age, the Vanderbilts were actually regarded as new money, nouveau riche. They were not part of elite Gilded Age society. And the elite Gilded Age society in the 1880s was ruled, as anyone who's been watching the HBO series Gilded Age knows, was ruled with an iron fist by Katherine Astor. So Alva took it upon herself to break the Vanderbilts into Gilded Age society. And again, if anyone is watching the HBO show, the character of Mrs. Russell is very transparently based on Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt. Alva determined that she would break them into society by throwing the greatest party anyone had ever seen. And she was actually really brilliant and canny in the way that she was able to negotiate both the social mores of this time and also the nascent society press that was beginning to form at this time. So Alva did a couple of things. First, she enlisted Ward McAllister, who was the right-hand man of Caroline Astor. Ward McAllister was a Southern gentleman, also Southern, like Alva, from Savannah, Georgia, who had set himself up as like a professional snob. He was the guy who knew, he was the guy to know. He knew the right flowers, he knew the right dances, he knew the right chef. He was the tastemaker. And so he and Caroline kind of lorded over Gilded Age society at this time. So first, Alva enlisted Ward McAllister's help planning the party. Second, she had the insight to see that she could throw this party at a time during Lent when no one else in Gilded Age society was throwing parties. So it was the only big party that was going to happen. It was going to happen towards the end of March, after the traditional society season had ended. So she would have no competition whatsoever. She started dropping hints about the party in the press, so everyone knew how fabulous and amazing it was going to be. It was going to be a fancy dress ball, which is to say a costume ball. And because this is Gilded Age society, a costume isn't just putting on a fun hat and calling it a day. It's ordering your bespoke, couture, historical costume from Worth in Paris and having it delivered in time. So Alva was going to go as a Venetian princess. This is a time when everyone went in costumes. Like when I think of a costume party, I put on a pair of cat ears or a witch hat, and that's about all I do. Yeah. But at that time, people would go as the Duke de Guise or other historical figures like this. So everyone is talking about Alva's ball. Everyone is getting prepared. Now, Caroline Astor at this time had a marriageable daughter, Carrie, who was newly out in society. This is the moment in time when we first start to see the beginning structures of what we have come to call debutante balls. In fact, Ward McAllister was one of the founders of an organization called the Patriarch, which was one of the first organizations that put on debutante balls in New York City in the 19th century. And I love that he came up with that term, the Patriarch. It sounds like an organization that's been around since the dawn of time, but actually he just invented it out of whole cloth, which I think is very American and very genius. So everyone knew that the ball was going to happen. Carrie Astor was beside herself with excitement over the ball. And then Alva let it be known that tragically, Carrie would not be able to come to the ball. And the reason for this is because Mrs. Astor had never deigned to call on Alva Vanderbilt. Now, at this time period, calling was a very arcane and formal system of maintaining and sustaining social relationships. It didn't necessarily mean hanging out with someone. It meant stopping by the house at a designated moment in time and leaving your card. Often you wouldn't necessarily even visit with someone unless they were having hours at home. In fact, one of my favorite paintings that alludes to this topic is an Eastman Johnson painting called Not at Home, which is actually a painting of a haute bourgeois woman in the 1870s sneaking up a staircase so that she doesn't have to receive anybody. I love that painting, but it's an allusion to the importance and the formality and the inescapability of calling as a necessity in Gilded Age culture. So what Alva does is actually pretty masterful because she has kind of maneuvered Caroline Astor into a corner. Caroline Astor has to retain her power. She knows that she needs to take the steps necessary to retain her power. So, for instance, a few years previously, in the great throwdown over the opera between the Academy of Music, which was the traditional old New York place for going to hear opera, and the new Metropolitan Opera, the night that the Metropolitan Opera opened, Caroline Astor arranged to be out of town because she was waiting to see where the cards would fall. She didn't want to waste her power aligning with the wrong thing. So Caroline can't sit this one out. Yeah. Because she knows that if she doesn't allow Carrie to go, she risks the ball being a success without her and then losing some of her influence and her power. But in order to enable Carrie to go, she has to call on Alva. And that effectively will acknowledge Alva Vanderbilt and admit the Vanderbilts into high society. So Alva is like the perfect social chess move that Alva managed to orchestrate. So Caroline folds. She ends up one day, her carriage leaves her mansion, which was on Fifth Avenue and 34th Street, right where the Empire State Building is today. Carriage leaves, goes up Fifth Avenue to Alva Vanderbilt's Petit Chateau house that is on, I want to say 66, or was at 66th and Fifth Avenue. A footman descends from the carriage, leaves the card. The door opens, the card is received by another liveried footman. The door is closed and the carriage drives away. The women do not meet. But because Alva has left her card and therefore officially called on, or excuse me, because Caroline has left her card and called on Alva Vanderbilt, the Vanderbilts are in. Carrie is invited to the ball. Carrie triumphs at the ball. And in fact, even Mrs. Astor went to Alva's ball. And she also went costumed as a Venetian princess, which cannot have been a coincidence, if you ask me, because certainly Ward McAllister must have had a hand in that. And so that was really the moment that the Vanderbilts broke into high society. But then what I will say is that is not what got me the job. What got me the job was not the account I just gave you of Alva's ball. What got me the job, I learned later, was my description of the costume worn by a woman named Miss Kate Fearing Strong to this ball. Miss Kate Fearing Strong went costumed as a cat. Her costume consisted of a skirt made of cat tails, white cat tails, beautiful bodice, couture, off the shoulder, gorgeous. And she wore on her head, she's blonde, her blonde hair is all heaped up. On top of her hair is perched a complete taxidermied white cat. Perched on top of her head with
Holy
eyes and
smoke.
ears and whiskers. And around her neck is a black choker, a velvet choker, and in diamond letters is the word puss. And it was the description of that costume that got me the job working on these books with Anderson. And it's been a lot of
You're hired. Yeah, you're hired.
fun.
As the audience can already tell, you're a fantastic storyteller.
Hmm,
So let's get to
thanks.
some other stories. I want to start kind of way back.
Mhm,
And with every kind of generational wealth story, that there's always a beginning.
mhm,
And the beginning is not always pretty.
mhm,
There's lots of grit, resilience,
mhm,
failure, starting again, and
mhm.
this story is no different. Can you tell us about John Jacob Astor and the beginnings of the Astor fortunes?
Certainly. And one thing Anderson and I talked about with both of these books was, and it's a question we're asked from time to time, like, what is it about these men that made them able to achieve the things that they were able to achieve? Because certainly in the case of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who at one time controlled, I think, one out of every $20 in existence, which is hard to imagine. And John Jacob Astor is not that different. He made his
Yeah,
money a generation before Cornelius Vanderbilt, just about. John Jacob Astor was born in Waldorf, Germany, which is a small town which is now best known for white asparagus and for the fact that John Jacob Astor was born there. He had a couple of siblings, he had a couple of brothers, and his father was a butcher. So he was not particularly well educated, um, but he definitely had a particular strain of grit. So one of his brothers left ahead of him and moved to London, and another of his brothers left and moved to New York, and another brother stayed behind. And actually, the Astors were involved in politics in Waldorf, Germany, I think as late as the 1970s. So just like that strain of Astors just stayed there. John Jacob, who began his life as Johann Jakob, I suppose, first moved to London to spend some time with his brother, and it is likely there that he learned English and anglicized his name, although supposedly he spoke with kind of a thick German accent for much of his life. His brother had a musical instrument company, and so he worked with his brother for a time. And then when he decided that he was going to go across the Atlantic and visit his other brother, stay with his other brother, he came alone. He came in I think he was in his early 20s, and he had a stack of flutes with him that he was planning to bring. He traveled across the Atlantic for about a month. When they arrived in Baltimore, and the harbor, the Chesapeake, was all frozen in. So he was stuck on the ship for a certain period of time with the other passengers. And supposedly on this journey, he met someone who, by happenstance, had had been trading in furs like a little bit, and told him how much money there was to be made in furs. So Astor disembarked, walked over the ice eventually with a bunch of people. They walk across the ice into Baltimore, and he eventually makes his way up to New York City. Now, at the time, his brother Henry was in New York and was also working as a butcher. And Henry had made a lot of money, partly because of very aggressive marketing strategies. He would buy kind of cheap cuts of meat from out in the countryside and then would sell them in kind of a forcible way to people. So already within the Astor family, there's a certain degree of pitilessness,
salesmanship.
salesmanship, but
We'll
but
say.
it's a little bit more than salesmanship. It's pitilessness in their approach to doing business. And I think that will become apparent
Okay.
as you look at the story for John Jacob Astor himself. But there are also a couple of kind of overlapping character traits or experiences, I think, that inform his ability to be successful. One is, whereas initially his story seems to align with this kind of American immigrant up by your bootstraps narrative that we're all probably pretty familiar with. He didn't arrive with nothing, right? He actually arrived with goods that he could sell, so he had some capital at his disposal. Not a ton, but he had some. And he also arrived having already learned English, and he arrived with a network essentially in place because of his brother. So he had some advantages going for him at the same time. It seems that he had a bit of an ear for languages, because early in his career, he would actually travel into the wilderness himself And he learned a few indigenous languages like Oneida, and was able to trade with indigenous people for furs, thereby cutting out the middleman. So having an ear for languages helped him in his early days of his business, but also having been the son of a butcher, he was accustomed to really stomach churning work. And the fur trade could be really stomach turning work. It was smelly, the furs were heavy, they were dusty, they were full of mites. It was tough. And most people at that time who were doing trading for furs would lose a certain cut of their potential profits because they preferred to work with middlemen. They preferred to outsource the disgusting part of the work. So early on, John Jacob Astor, having learned that you could trade or sell furs back in Europe at sometimes as much as an 800 to 900% markup, he first started kind of asking around in New York. He was doing odd jobs. He worked for his brother for a time. He worked for another man for a time. He sold cakes in the street for a time. He did this and that. He married a woman whose family ran a boarding house, who herself was a very shrewd negotiator, and it turned out had a nice eye for furs and was not put off by the idea of hard work. So initially, he got his start by asking around, hanging around on the waterfront, going to the coffee houses. This is in the very late part of the 18th century. Going around to coffee houses and coming into furs whenever he could get his hands on one, because sometimes travelers would just kind of happen upon one and he would collect them together. And when he had enough for a shipment, he would ship them back and sell them and start making his money that way. This is also right around the time of Lewis and Clark's voyage across the interior of North America to reach the Pacific. And so part of what Astor has going for him too is timing. He happens to get there at a time when the interior of North America is about to open, and it is about to open kind of like in a great rush. He ends up very quickly being able to have a monopoly over fur trade. It's in competition with the monopoly that's controlled in Canada, but he hires away Canadian fur trappers in order to work for him. At one point, he is in cahoots with Thomas Jefferson to try to establish a parallel country on the West Coast. We have a chapter about this in the book in Astor, in which John Jacob Astor establishes the Pacific Fur Company as if it were an independent entity, but it is really himself. It's like a front for himself. And the plan, with the backing and support of Thomas Jefferson when Thomas Jefferson is president, is to send one overland company and one company by the sea route around the Horn to rendezvous at the mouth of the Columbia River in what is today Astoria, Oregon, and establish a trading post there, and then have Astoria, Oregon be kind of the gateway to trade with what was then called the Orient. The idea was to have a parallel country on the West Coast that was founded by essentially settlers from the United States, to have the boundary between those countries be along the Mississippi River or possibly along the Continental Divide, to have all of the trade be focused on trade with China and Japan in that direction, in the same way that the East Coast, like New York, was focused on trade with Europe. The Pacific Fur Company ended up failing for a number of reasons. But at that time, Astor started plowing his money, the considerable fortune that he'd made in fur trading. He started plowing it into real estate in New York City. And again, he is the beneficiary of a happy accident of timing, because he starts buying into Manhattan real estate just as fresh waves of immigration are starting to really pour into the city from Europe. And so this is the moment when this is the moment in time in the early 19th century when New York starts to outpace other cities like Philadelphia, Boston, Salem, other East Coast cities, and becoming a real European powerhouse and a center for immigration. And so Astor establishes a pretty ruthless way of acquiring land. And in fact, on his deathbed, he said that his only regret was that he didn't buy even more land in Manhattan. He was able to buy up land that was cheap. He was able to lend money and then foreclose on people and pick up land that way. And the number of places that are in modern day Manhattan that were at one time controlled by the Astors is really staggering. Greenwich Village, that was all owned by the Astors. Times Square, all owned by the Astors. the Empire State Building, which before it had the Empire State Building on it, had the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and before the Waldorf Astoria Hotel had two Astor mansions next to each other. That was Astorland as well. So some of it has to do with his unique character traits. Some of it has to do with his unique talents. And a lot of it has to do with his timing. Because one of the chapters that we have in
Yeah.
Astor that I'm pretty proud of traces the trajectory of a different person named John Jacob Astor. There was another John Jacob Astor who was born in Waldorf, Germany, who traveled to New York in his 20s. But this John Jacob Astor traveled in the middle of the 19th century instead of the end of the 18th. And he ended up working his entire life as a cigar roller and dying in a poorhouse on Blackwell's Island. Now, were there character trait differences? Sure. Were there opportunity differences? 100%. But there's also something to be said about the accident of timing.
So there are a few themes that I feel like cut across many families of generational wealth, and I just want to give you like a theme, and then if we could like hit on a story, is that all right?
Sure,
One of the
do my best.
one of the themes is living in long shadows. Heirs that follow parents that happen to be industry titans or leaders in their community oftentimes struggle with their own identity or just how to escape from the shadow of their parents. Who would be an example of this in the Astor family? I mean, I'm sure there's lots of them, but if you want to give us one story.
That immediately leaps to mind. So I mentioned the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The reason that the Waldorf Astoria came into existence was because of two grumpy Astor cousins who lived next door to each other. So the Astor family eventually established a family office or accounting house, essentially, to manage all of their holdings in Manhattan. And through primogeniture, the position in this counting house would fall from father to son. So by the time you get to the very early part of the 20th century, the two heads of the Astor family are cousins. John Jacob Astor, and I'm going to blank on which Roman numeral he should have after his name, because it actually gets rather confusing. Everyone is named John Jacob Astor, except they're often lateral rather than linear. It's a little hard to keep everybody straight. So forgive me for not remembering off the top of my head which Roman numeral he should have. But John Jacob Astor was also called Jack, and this is the Jack Astor who ended up going down on the Titanic. And his mother was Caroline, the queen of society. And so his father had actually been William Backhouse Astor. His cousin is named William Waldorf Astor. And I just tell you, I've already written a book about these people, and it's hard for me to keep all the names straight, even now. His cousin is William Waldorf Astor. And William Waldorf lives next door to Jack and Caroline. Caroline is Jack's mother. And there are a couple of things that are funny about this. One is that because William Waldorf was older than Jack, when his father died, he felt that by rights, he became, as eldest Astor heir, he became the head of the family. And since he was the head of the family, his wife, Mrs. William Astor, should be the female head of the family. Now, as you can imagine, that didn't sit very well with Caroline, who was, by the way, Mrs. William Astor. And in each instance, the two Mrs. William Astors had calling cards that only read Mrs. Astor on them. And pity the poor postmaster, because they lived next door to each other in Manhattan. They also had homes next door to each other in Newport, Rhode Island. And for a time, that means that there were two competing Mrs. William Astors competing for primacy, each of whom insisted she should be addressed simply as Mrs. Astor. So if you've ever heard the phrase the Mrs. Astor, that's where that comes from. It is because that's Caroline. Caroline eventually reigned supreme in the great calling card throwdown of whichever year that was. She reigned supreme as the Mrs. Astor. William Waldorf Astor is actually a pretty fascinating character. He is an example of what you're talking about, Dave, of someone who struggled mightily to make his own path and went to some pretty extreme lengths in order to do it. he was sent to college back in Germany. John Jacob Astor, having not had a college education or being undereducated, insisted on his sons and grandsons being well educated. And so in many instances, the Astors either went to Columbia or they went to, or they were sent back to study at, I think, the University of Heidelberg, if I'm not mistaken. William Waldorf went back to study in Europe, and he was reading literature and he was studying music, and he had this kind of sylvan youth in which he got to bask himself. He was a tremendous collector of art and decorative art objects and armor, and he developed his taste for that collecting while he was in Europe. And it seems by all accounts that he had kind of a romantic side. He fell in love with a woman in Italy, and they weren't permitted to marry, although he stayed friends with her, I think, until her death. And then his father, the long reach of the family business, dragged William Waldorf back to the family counting house and back to Manhattan, kind of under duress. He didn't really want to do it. In fact, of all things, the first dream William Waldorf Astor had for what he wanted to be, and I personally, as you can imagine, find what I'm about to say hilarious to reveal, he dreamed of being a historical fiction novelist, which I
Who
find
wouldn't want
very
to be one,
dramatic.
Catherine?
Who wouldn't want to be a historical fiction novelist? It's so glamorous. Um, and he did actually write and publish a couple of historical novels, although it must be said that much of his publishing output was in journals and outlets that he himself controlled. But so his first dream was of this kind of artistic side. Then he tried to go into politics. And so he was running for office in Manhattan. But as you can imagine, William Waldorf Astor, despite his wish to do so, did not have a common touch. You know, he would go into these beer halls in the late 19th century. You've seen Gangs of New York. Gangs of New York is actually not as inaccurate as you might think. So it's a couple generations after that, but he is in late 19th century New York, which is a rough and tumble town peopled with immigrants. He'd go into all these German beer halls. He could speak German because he'd studied in Germany. And he'd bust out German and he'd talk about his father coming up by the bootstraps and he'd glad hand everybody. But whenever he tried to, and he'd buy everyone drinks, of course. But whenever he was there, he never took off his gloves to shake anyone's hand. And he always had a carriage waiting for him right outside to whisk him away. So like he did the best that he could to have a common touch and to get involved in politics, but he couldn't succeed. And he started to feel frustrated with New York. He felt like, and perhaps this will resonate with some of your listeners, or certainly with you, Dave, because I think it's something we talked about before. He felt like there was no way for him to be. Like all the things that he tried to do for himself, the ways he tried to distinguish himself, he was laughed at for his attempts. Because why would he do that? Because he already had so much wealth. He already had something to do. He had the counting house to manage. So his attempts to do other things were roundly mocked in the press, especially his attempts to enter politics. And he was very hurt by it. He took it very, very personally. And he started to bemoan the fact that in American culture, this was actually, I think, kind of a profound thing that he said, and it's something I think about a lot. He bemoaned the fact that in American culture, there's something undemocratic about great wealth. That, like, on the one hand, it's part of our narrative and it's part of our mythology and it's something that we celebrate. But in our culture, we don't have a way for a person to be idle and still valued. Whereas in European culture, specifically in British culture, there is a rhetorical category for an aristocrat, essentially, for someone whose job it is to maintain, whose job it is to represent, whose job it is to symbolize, and not necessarily to do. Like in American culture, we lionize wealthy people, but usually they're wealthy people who are doing something, playing basketball, singing a song, even being beautiful. William Waldorf didn't have any of these avenues available to him. And so William Waldorf actually turned his back on New York. He tore down the house he'd grown up in and he built a hotel and he called it the Waldorf. And ostensibly, he named it after the town in Germany where his grandfather had come from. But really, I think we can all agree, he named it after himself, William Waldorf. And this was a double no thumb because he built this hotel and he built it next door to Caroline Astor's house. It was on the south side. Anyone who's ever spent any time in Manhattan knows how important it is to have southern facing windows, because that's where all your sun comes from. So he built this towering structure. It was as tall as the Flatiron Building, which hadn't even been built yet, and which is one of the earliest skyscrapers. The Waldorf was monstrous by late 19th century standards, by 1890 standards. And it cast Caroline Astor's beautiful townhouse, the center of Gilded Age society, the house that contained the ballroom that gave us the phrase, the 400. He cast it all in shadow. And he drove Caroline Astor crazy. In fact, she was so upset at the building of this hotel next door that she thought about tearing down her own house and building a stable, just so that everyone coming into the Waldorf would be bothered by the smell of manure all the time. Well, eventually his cousin Jack saw the wisdom of the Waldorf. The Astors had already been in hospitality before. There had been Astor House, which had been built by John Jacob Astor very far downtown in the early part of the 19th century, and for many years had been kind of the social center for like demi-monde in New York for quite a long time. So this is not the first hotel in the Astor portfolio. But eventually Jack tore his house down and built the Astoria, and the Waldorf and the Astoria were connected by some elegant corridors, the most famous of which was called Peacock Alley. In fact, there's a short film you can see about Peacock Alley that's on YouTube that's kind of wonderful. But it was connected by these passageways. And the passageways, I hasten to add, because the relationship between the cousins was always so fraught, even though they were working in the same counting house on different sides of the same, essentially of the same office. They had separate staff, though, and they had separate money. They had an uneasy truce. But in the first Waldorf Astoria, which was standing until 1893 until 1929, they always retained the option of dividing them by cutting off the corridors and turning them back into two separate entities, which is kind of fascinating. And then William Waldorf went to London and he never looked back. He then made it his project to get a peerage, which he finally did shortly before his death. He didn't return for the opening of the Waldorf Astoria. He came back to New York merely a handful of times after that. One was to open the Astor Hotel, which was in Times Square, and which was aimed at a more kind of middle-class audience. But William Waldorf, because he couldn't find his path in New York, he left. He cut a new path for himself, and he was the progenitor of the line of Astors who are still in the UK today.
Pretty sad, actually. Pretty
I know,
sad.
I have some pity for him. I
yourself.
do. I'm interested by William Waldorf, but and his sense of pique and his sense of abandonment and his sense of despair in a way.
So I think that connects me to kind of this next principle, which is loneliness and isolation. As oftentimes as a family's wealth grows, there's more question marks as to why people want to get close to them, and there may be relationship question marks as to why are people paying attention to them. And I felt like you told a story of this loneliness and isolation, specifically about Vincent and the Normal Hall. Would you be willing to tell us that story?
Yes, absolutely. So Vincent was Jack's son. And in each case, by the way, both Jack and Will had unflattering nicknames in the press. Jack Astor had an unflattering nickname of Jackass for partly because of the treatment that he meted out to a tramp that broke into his mother's house and was found sleeping in one of the servants' rooms. He really wanted the law to throw the book at this tramp, and public opinion really turned against him for that. And William, when he went to Great Britain, he bought a palace estate called Cliveden, which you can still visit. Whereas there's a tradition of great country houses, even at that time, being kind of open. They were private houses, but people would go picnic on the lands. You could stop and you could boat through. You could come on tours often. They were regarded in some sense as public heritage that happened to be privately owned. When William Waldorf Astor bought Cliveden, he stopped allowing people to come visit, and he put up a big gate so that you couldn't even see the house. And his unflattering nickname in the press became Walled Off Astor. so everyone has unflattering nicknames in the press. Jack's son, Vincent. Vincent was Jack's son from his first unhappy marriage to a woman named Ava. And then he remarried a teenager named Madeline. And it was Madeline who was with him and pregnant on Titanic when Titanic went down. Madeline survived, and her Titanic baby was also named John Jacob Astor, but he went by Jakey. Well, Vincent was only 21 when his father died on Titanic. And of course, at that point, William Waldorf had already gone to the UK. And so Vincent essentially stepped into this role, which by then in New York history and in New York society was a pretty established role of head of the Astor family. He became head of the Astor family at 21, which is pretty young. And he had already had kind of a pretty cloistered childhood. And in many instances, and he wasn't allowed many playmates because none of the playmates were good enough for him. And in some respects, everything that I read about Vincent suggested a profoundly lonely, somewhat emotionally stunted person, the kind of person who wanted to do good things, but who was very hemmed in by the pressures that were being foisted upon him. And so one thing and Anderson and I had different feelings about Vincent, and it's partly because his mother, Gloria, remembered Vincent and referred to him as dreadful, which according to Anderson was like the worst thing Gloria could say about anyone. And by all accounts, Vincent was a difficult man. He was an alcoholic. He was in poor health much of his life. He drank and smoked and was controlling and was married several times, and he was tough. But I nevertheless find myself with a certain degree of sympathy for him because I read some logs of his trip on Norma Hall. So the Astors were interested in yachting, as you can imagine, and as were the Vanderbilts. And Norma Hall was the name of Vincent Astor's yacht. His father had a yacht named Norma Hall as well. And rather notoriously, I think there were a few generations of Norma Halls, which is a name for it means seductress. So you already get a picture of some of the things that these yachts were used for. Mrs. Astor, Caroline, never set foot on her husband's yacht. And it's because her husband's yacht was used for extracurricular activities. So Vincent, like many Astor men before him, kind of took refuge on Norma Hall. And so I read a couple of logs of these trips, and he would endeavor to make them scientific expeditions, but really they were pleasure cruises for which he was kind of making winking scientific discoveries along the way. But he would go on this yacht with
I'm sure they were scientific for tax purposes, Catherine. I'm sure they were scientific for tax purposes.
Yeah, scientific wink wink. In which he brings along not only a doctor and someone from the American Museum of Natural History, but also his girlfriend and like a couple of other ladies who are there just to have a really nice time. But what's funny is when he's traveling on Norma Hall, there's a lot of silliness. There's a lot of jokes. There's a lot of, some of them are in kind of poor taste. He rather famously pulled a prank on one of his friends on one of these trips. And this will give you a picture, I think, of the kind of person Vincent is, which is to say challenging, but at the same time, you feel for him for what he's trying to do. So tell me if you think this is a good joke. One of his friends comes along, and before his friend comes along with him on this trip, Vincent has found out the stock holding that this friend possesses. And Norma Hall has a radio room. So as a prank, Vincent makes it sound like there are stock reports coming in suggesting that his friend, while on the yacht, has been ruined and has lost all of his money. It's funny, I guess, except that the friend doesn't know that it's a prank until I know it's tough. On the one hand, there's an impishness to it, but it's also kind of cruel in its lack of empathy. But Vincent, I hasten to add, for as complicated a character as he was, Vincent is the one who actually started to give away the money. The Astors were not particularly involved in philanthropy, with the exception of the Astor Library, which was founded by John Jacob Astor at the suggestion of his, I think, like a man he hired to read to him in his later days. And the Astor Library is one of several libraries that became consolidated in forming the New York Public Library, which is one reason that the Astor family supported the New York Public Library on a very important scale for such a very long time. So it was Vincent, though, who discovered, he was sort of naively unaware of the real quality of some of the real estate holdings that the Astors had. I haven't talked much about the Astors as slumlords, but in the 19th century, that is how their money came to be, and the money rolled in, as you can imagine. They were slumlords. In fact, they were the biggest slumlord next only to Trinity Church, which is itself a whole kettle of fish. Vincent discovered that he was an unwitting slumlord. In fact, he discovered that some of his holdings, I think in Hell's Kitchen, were being used as brothels, and was so distressed by it that he went around like knocking on doors trying to figure out where they were. So Vincent is the first one who starts actually selling real estate. He actually sells some subpar real estate almost at a loss, and essentially kind of leading to the formation of the New York City Housing Authority, the NYCHA. He pays for the construction of playgrounds. He pays for the construction of parklands. And eventually he kind of collapses the Astor family office and turns it into the Vincent Astor Foundation. And so it is Vincent who engineers the Astor like giving back to New York City. And his last wife, Brooke, there's a whole story behind that, but Brooke was his last wife, Brooke Astor. He had been Brooke Marshall. They were married for about 5 years, and he set it up for Brooke Astor to be in charge of dispensing money from the Vincent Astor Foundation, which she did, and she made a point of dispensing it in New York City because New York City had created the wealth for the Astors in the first place.
Very cool. Well, I don't want to hog all the time, so I want to, in our last few minutes that we have together, I'd love to open it up for any questions that the audience has about the Astors, the book, or just about the curiousness of the time. So let me go ahead and open it up. If you do have a question, feel free to either submit it in the chat or take yourself off of mute, and we'll call on you and invite your voice to the call.
Do I need to be looking?
I'm going to ask one more. Yeah, I'm gonna ask one more question then while people are thinking of theirs. Many of the people on our call today are advisors to families of wealth, and I feel like one of the challenges that is out there is just to have empathy. So what what is there to learn about the Astors and thinking from an advisor perspective? Like how do we develop an empathy for a family that they have generational struggles, but the types of struggles that many would say, yeah, I'd like to try that struggle on for a while. Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
It's funny, one question that Anderson and I talked about when we started working on Vanderbilt was he wanted to know if Commodore Vanderbilt was a psychopath, because Commodore Vanderbilt was so difficult and himself, and described himself as having what he called a mania for making money. And there's one thing that we talked about in planning the Vanderbilt book, and that was in the ways that the fortune could be seen as a kind of pathology or as a kind of contagion. And certainly in the approach of both of the books that we did in Vanderbilt and in Astor, we approached it from the standpoint of ordinary people caught in really extreme, extraordinary circumstances. Because being born into one of these families, like take Vincent, for instance. Vincent was utterly unprepared for what came to him when he was 21 years old, when his father died on Titanic. He was not emotionally prepared for it. He wasn't intellectually prepared for it. Constitutionally, all he wanted to do was be left alone. He was a tinkerer. he liked working on projects. He was a very enthusiastic model train operator. He had like life-size model trains you could ride on that he was very involved with. He once drove a steam-powered car down a street just to see if he could get it to work. Like Vincent was meant to be a tinkerer, and instead he was called upon to be a scion. And maybe that's a way that is part of the reason why I feel a degree of empathy for Vincent, because he didn't ask to be in that position. And I think given his brothers, he wouldn't have been in that position. And William Waldorf too. Like, I wonder, would William Waldorf have found more satisfaction in his life if he had been like an upper middle class guy who in New York in the 19th century who went to Columbia and then was a historical novelist?
Yeah.
It's an interesting question, and I think
Yeah,
the way that I found empathy in working on books about these people, and I will be very candid and say that many of the people in both of the books, Vanderbilt and Astor, I find personally quite distasteful. But at the same time, I remind myself that these are individual human people who, for the most part, did not ask to be put in the position that they are put in, and nevertheless have to cope with it. And it's an extreme position,
yeah.
and in some cases, maybe it's an enviable position. But then the other thing I said when you and I were chatting in our preparatory phone call, take another way to look at it is it's sort of optional. I mean, Brooke Astor's grandsons were disinherited, and yet they were very close to her. They are men they're a bit older than I am, but probably roughly my generation. They were disinherited. One of them is a professor. One of them is very active in elder care advocacy. And I don't know either of those men, have not met or spoken to them. But one wonders, I myself have wondered if, despite being disinherited, if that actually is not in some ways a gift. So there are a
Yeah,
couple
that's
of
an
ways
interesting thought.
that you could look at it that way, I think.
Yeah. Well, we just have another minute or so to take questions. Elaine, you have your hand up. What is your question? Elaine is my friend from Uganda, Catherine.
Hello, Elaine. I can't hear you, I'm afraid.
Oh, your computer might be muted.
I think your computer might be off, but if you want to type it in the chat, I can see it if you want to type it in the chat. I think I can see it.
Okay, we'll give Elaine a minute to type in the chat. Anyone else have a question while Elaine is typing in the chat?
Oh, hi.
Allison, go ahead.
Hi. Samir has a question in the chat. He said, were there any characters that played the role of mentor outside of the family?
That's a good question. I'll have to give it a little bit of thought. Yes, is the short answer. William Waldorf actually worked with a tutor, and I'm afraid I'm going to blank on his name because, as I mentioned to Dave earlier, I've written 2 books since Astor, so I'm digging through a little bit of dust on this one. William Waldorf worked very closely with his tutor at the University of Heidelberg, and they traveled together very extensively. And in fact, they were planning a trip to Turkey to look for antiquities. And this man was a real kind of intellectual mentor, but also maybe sort of an older brother figure to William Waldorf. And in some of the things that I read about Will, I got the sense that if he had not been forcibly dragged back to New York to assume the mantle of family head, my impression is that he would have stayed on and studied further with his tutor and perhaps gone into a more academic or bookish way of being. So yeah, there are these instances of people, particularly I think in the context of education, in which there is room for being seen outside of the name or being seen outside of the wealth. But I think it's, as time moved on, at least in the case of the Astors and the Vanderbilts, and also as the relationship of the family and the press changes, maintaining the degree of privacy or remove necessary to have those kinds of intimate, emotional, or intellectual relationship, I think is maybe more and more challenging. So, we live in a
Well,
moment where it's hard to be anonymous in the 21st century in a way where I think in the 19th century, it could be the further away you were from home, the more anonymous you could be.
well, and you think of the pressure that they would have at a young age, always in the spotlight, never
Mhm.
really room to grow and make mistakes on their own. I
Mhm.
mean, you see it with whether it's young actors or athletes or whatever that grow up
Mhm.
in, maybe with professional athletes as parents, and there's just nowhere for them to hide, really,
Yeah.
So that's got to be challenging. Okay, I want to get to Elaine's question before we have to close here. Elaine, thanks so much. It says, I've always thought that it takes a certain type of almost obsessive character to build a family enterprise. Having written all these books, do you think that this in part may be the reason why it's sometimes hard for the ones that come after them? So I
I
think
mean,
the question
certainly,
is that
yeah.
obsessive.
I certainly, in the case of, there's a possibly apocryphal story which holds that Commodore Vanderbilt's last words were to his son, and the last words were, "Keep the money together." In everything that we read about, both Anderson and I ended up having a greater degree of affection for Commodore Vanderbilt after we finished working on the book than we did when we started on the book. But he was unapologetic in being single-mindedly focused on maximizing profit at every turn. And I think the same could be said for John Jacob Astor. He was single-mindedly focused on it. Um, as I said, we didn't really get to talk about the Astor system of real estate ownership in New York City that basically rewarded squalor. It was like New York City in the 19th century was more dangerous to live in from a life expectancy standpoint than was the London of Charles Dickens, which gives us the term Dickensian. Um, and
Mm,
that was due in large part to squalid living conditions, much of which were controlled by the Astor family. And
yeah,
so, in order to be comfortable with that from a moral perspective, requires, I think, a degree of monomaniacal focus on money getting. It's a focus I myself do not have, and therefore, like, obviously, look at my career choice. Um, it's one that I don't have, and therefore, it's one that I find challenging to understand. But it's clearly it is a focus that many people have. I don't know if people are born with it. I don't know if you can have it taught to you. But I also do think in some instances, especially in the case of these two kind of patriarchs that we're talking about, that focus was often to the exclusion of their family relationships even. In
yeah.
every case with Commodore Vanderbilt, the son who wound up being his heir was he subjected him to famous bouts of verbal and physical abuse. He called him the Blatherskite. Uh, and he only finally started to respect his son when his son cheated him in a business maneuver.
Mm,
It's tough. I mean, that is not a relationship that I would want to have with my father, my son.
yeah. Well, Katherine, I want to thank you personally for making the time, sharing some of these wonderful stories. You've only scratched the surface, so everyone who has not picked up a copy of Astor, you'll be happy that you did. It's really interesting.
Well, I'd also just like to mention,
And with
if I
that,
may, sorry, Dave,
go
could I
for it.
just jump in? Anyone who would like to keep up with me for
Yes.
any reason, I have a website, which is katherinehowe.com, and I'm also on Instagram and Facebook and Goodreads. And because I have a book coming out on April the 30th, I'll be appearing at several book festivals in the spring, including in Virginia and in Florida, and I think in Pittsburgh and on Nantucket. And so if anyone happens to find themselves in those areas and wants to say hello, I hope to see some people on the road.
Remind us of the name of that book so people can look for it.
The one that's coming out on April 30th is called The Penguin Book of Pirates. It's a primary source reader
Okay.
about piracy. But I mean, it's not all that different insofar as it is about a monomaniacal drive for independence, financial independence. It's just in a very different context.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Next month on Authors at Drucker, we're going to hear from David York about his book, The Gift of Lift, Harnessing the Power of Stewardship to Elevate the World. So another great author next month. Again, Katherine, thank you so much. And thank you all in the audience for investing an hour with us today. And we hope to see you next month. Thanks, Katherine.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time.